I spent 6 months living in a basement and serving coffee just to see if she was a gold digger. I was seconds away from popping the question with a fake $50 ring when my family stormed the bistro. Now my cover is blown, and the woman I love is staring at the dragon tattoo I told her I didn't have. The fluorescent lights of the subway station flickered, casting a sickly yellow hue over the tired commuters. But Kenji didn't notice the grime. His eyes were fixed on a small, makeshift flower stall tucked between a newsstand and a turnstile. The vendor was an elderly man with skin like wrinkled parchment, selling bundles of carnations and slightly wilted daisies for $5. To Kenji Sato, a man who had once commissioned a garden of rare orchids from the foothills of the Andes for a single gala, these flowers were objectively pathetic. They were the kind of bouquet a man bought when he was down to his last cent and desperate to show he cared. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 5 crumpled single-dollar bills, money he had earned earlier that day by scrubbing a spilled milkshake off a linoleum floor. As he handed the cash over, he felt a strange, jarring pride. This wasn't the family's money. This was Liam's money. He walked the 3 blocks to Mia's small apartment, shielding the cheap plastic wrapping from the evening wind. His heart hammered against his ribs in a way that an impending gang war had never managed to trigger. He was playing a dangerous game, weaving a tapestry of lies so thick he sometimes struggled to breathe under the weight of them. He reached her door and paused, checking his reflection in the hallway fire extinguisher's glass. The theater makeup on his neck was holding. The jagged tail of the dragon tattoo remained buried under a layer of beige cream. He took a breath, smoothed his hair, and knocked. When Mia opened the door, she was still in her nursing scrubs, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, looking exhausted down to her bones. But the moment her eyes fell on the meager bouquet, her entire face transformed. It was as if he had handed her a crown of stars. She gasped, a small, genuine sound of delight that made Kenji's stomach twist into a knot of pure guilt. She didn't see the browning edges of the petals or the cheapness of the ribbon. She saw a man who had worked a double shift and still thought of her on his way home. "Liam," she whispered, taking the flowers with a reverence that felt like a physical blow to his chest. "You shouldn't have spent your tip money on these. I know you're saving for your car repairs." She brought the flowers to her nose, inhaling deeply, and for a second, she looked more beautiful than any socialite he had ever known. She treated those $5 flowers like they were diamonds, carefully trimming the stems and placing them in a chipped glass jar that sat in the center of her small kitchen table. Kenji watched her, his hands trembling slightly in his pockets. Every time she smiled at Liam, a piece of Kenji died. He wanted to scream the truth. He wanted to tell her that he could fill her apartment with roses until she couldn't see the walls. He wanted to confess that he was a lie, a predator hiding in a sheep's sweater. But then she turned around and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head on his shoulder. She smelled like antiseptic and lavender, the scent of a girl who spent her life healing people, while he spent his life breaking them. "You're too good to me," she murmured against his chest. The guilt finally boiled over, a hot, acidic tide in his throat. He realized then that he wasn't just testing her love. He was stealing her innocence, feeding her a version of himself that didn't exist. He squeezed her back, his eyes catching the dark, armored SUV idling at the corner of the street through the window. His time was running out, and the beauty of her smile was the only thing keeping the monster at bay. The humidity of the Rusty Anchor Bistro felt heavier than usual as Kenji pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, a tray of empty beer bottles balanced on his palm. The clatter of silverware and the low hum of evening chatter usually acted as a sedative for his jagged nerves. But tonight, the air felt electric, charged with the finality of a death sentence. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, careful not to smudge the thick layer of concealer hiding the ink on his temple. This was it, the last shift, the last hour of the grand performance. He had spent months playing the part of the struggling waiter, learning the rhythm of a life defined by honest exhaustion, but the weight of the Sato legacy was pulling him back into the depths. He looked at the clock above the bar, the red digital numbers ticking down like a detonator. In 60 minutes, he would walk to table 4, take Mia's hand, and dismantle the world they had built together in order to build something real. He had spent the morning in his secret office, a sterile glass box overlooking the city's skyline, signing the documents that would effectively erase him from the Sato hierarchy. His father had called him a fool, a traitor to his blood, but Kenji had only felt a profound sense of relief. He was willing to trade the skyscrapers and the silk suits for the smell of grease and the sound of Mia's laughter. He reached into his apron pocket, his fingers brushing against the velvet box that held the ring. It wasn't the $5 silver band he had shown the jeweler. It was a simple, flawless diamond he had selected from his family's private vault. It was a bridge between his two lives, the quality of a king, but the simplicity of a man who just wanted to be a husband. He imagined the look on her face when he finally confessed. He would start with the name. He would tell her that Kenji Sato was a man of shadows, but Liam was the man he had become because of her. He moved through the dining room with a practiced grace, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, his mind a whirlwind of rehearsed speeches. He saw Mia arrive, her silhouette framed by the glowing "open" sign. She was wearing a simple blue dress, the one she'd bought at a thrift store and tailored herself. She looked like a dream of a life he didn't deserve. As she sat down, she gave him that small, tired wave that always made his heart ache. He wanted to run to her right then, to pull her out of the bistro and drive until the city lights were nothing but a memory. But the protocol of the test demanded he finish the act. He had to be Liam one last time. He had to ensure that when he revealed the truth, there would be no more shadows between them. He felt a strange sense of mourning for the waiter. Liam was a good man. Liam was the man Mia loved. Kenji feared that once the Sato name was spoken aloud, the light in her eyes would vanish, replaced by the same terror he saw in everyone else's. The kitchen staff shouted orders, the bell chimed, and the steam from the dishwasher rose like a fog, but Kenji was focused entirely on the woman at table 4. He could see her checking her phone, likely worrying about the cost of the anniversary dinner they had planned. She didn't know that the bill had already been paid in a currency she couldn't imagine. He took a deep breath, his hand steady as he gripped the tray. This was the precipice. Behind him lay the blood-stained throne of an empire. Before him lay the uncertain, beautiful heart of an innocent girl. He began to walk toward her, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. He was leaving the life behind, burning the bridges of the Sato name to ash. He was seconds away from his confession, seconds away from freedom. He didn't see the shadow of a man standing by the entrance, nor did he hear the low rumble of an engine that didn't belong in this neighborhood. He only saw Mia, his anchor, the girl who had saved a monster without even knowing it. Tonight, the lie would die, and he prayed that their love wouldn't die with it. The steam rising from the fresh mugs of coffee was a soft, white veil that blurred the edges of the room, but it couldn't mask the sudden chill that swept through the Rusty Anchor Bistro. Kenji moved mechanically, his body operating on a muscle memory developed over months of serving the same neighborhood regulars. He set a steaming plate of pasta in front of a retired dock worker, offering a practiced, humble smile that never reached his eyes. His gaze was constantly drawn back to Mia, who sat by the window, the amber light of the street lamp catching the gold in her hair. She was a vision of peace in a world that was rapidly beginning to fracture. Every time he stepped near her table, the weight of the ring in his pocket felt like a leaden anchor, pulling him toward the moment of truth. He wanted to tell her now, to whisper the confession into her ear and spirit her away, before the air turned sour. But the rhythm of the restaurant kept him tethered to the floor. As he turned back toward the counter to grab a fresh carafe, a movement through the glass front doors caught his eye. It was subtle at first, the way the streetlights were suddenly eclipsed by something large and matte black. A sleek SUV, followed by another, pulled up to the curb with a predatory silence that didn't belong in this part of town. The tires didn't screech, they simply claimed the pavement. Kenji's heart didn't just race, it slammed against his ribs with the force of a trapped animal. He knew those vehicles. He knew the reinforced glass, the darkened tint, and the specific low hum of the engines. They weren't just cars, They were the iron fist of the Sato legacy. His past hadn't just found him, it had arrived to collect its debt. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, the carafe of warm coffee trembling in his grip, as he realized the sanctuary he had built with Mia was nothing more than a house of cards in a hurricane. The Rusty Anchor regulars continued to eat and laugh, oblivious to the wolf at the door, but Kenji saw the world in high-definition terror. Through the glass, he saw the doors of the SUVs swing open in perfect synchronization. Men in tailored charcoal suits stepped out, their posture stiff, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses despite the night. These weren't the common street thugs he dealt with in the lower tiers of the syndicate. These were his elite guard, the men who had sworn their lives to the Shadow Dragon. They were here because something had gone horribly wrong, or perhaps because his father had finally decided that the play acting was over. Kenji looked at Mia, who was still looking at her menu, a small, innocent smile on her lips. She was so close to the window, so close to the cold steel that was about to shatter her reality. The contrast between the warm, domestic comfort of the bistro and the lethal efficiency of the men outside made him feel physically ill. He tried to steady his breathing, but the air felt like it was thickening into industrial smoke. He had promised himself that tonight would be the night he walked away, but the Sato name didn't allow for exits. It only allowed for temporary absences. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had brought the danger directly to her doorstep. By pretending to be Liam the waiter, he had stripped Mia of the protection she would have had if she were a Sato bride. Yet he had kept all the targets on her back. He watched as the lead enforcer, a man named Daiki, whose face was a map of old scars, adjusted his jacket and began walking toward the entrance. Kenji's hand tightened around the handle of the coffee pot until his knuckles turned white. He had a split second to decide. The bell above the door didn't just chime. It seemed to scream as the heavy glass entrance was thrown open with a violence that silenced the entire room. The warm, humming atmosphere of the Rusty Anchor Bistro vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a cold, suffocating vacuum. 3 men, built like stone pillars and draped in the kind of expensive razor-sharp wool that only power can buy, marched into the center of the dining area. Their presence was a physical weight, a dark stain on the humble brick and wood of the restaurant. Kenji stood frozen near the coffee station, the white ceramic mug in his hand feeling like a toy in the grip of a giant. He felt the heavy makeup on his neck cracking as his muscles tensed, the hidden dragon beneath the cream seemingly clawing to get out. He looked at the lead enforcer, Daiki, whose eyes swept the room with the clinical detachment of a man looking for a target. When those eyes landed on Kenji, the search ended. The restaurant fell into a terrifying, unnatural silence. The regulars stopped chewing, their forks suspended in midair, sensing the arrival of something predatory. Mia, who had been sitting just a few feet away, slowly turned her head toward the newcomers. Her eyes were wide, her hands still resting on the edge of the glass jar containing the cheap carnations Kenji had given her. She looked from the terrifying men in sunglasses back to Kenji, her brow furrowing in a search for an explanation that wasn't coming. Then, in a movement so synchronized it felt choreographed by fate, the 3 men stopped exactly 5 paces from the waiter's station. They snapped their heels together and bent their bodies at the waist in a deep, formal Japanese bow. The sound of their voices rang out in unison, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Young master, the council has been compromised. We must extract you immediately." The words, "young master," echoed off the brick walls, sounding absurd and alien in a place that smelled of spilled beer and old grease. Kenji didn't move. He couldn't. He watched as Mia's face underwent a slow, agonizing transformation. She didn't look angry. There was no flash of fire or righteous indignation in her gaze. Instead, she looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. Her lips parted slightly, a soft, trembling breath escaping them as she stared at the man she knew as Liam. She looked at his cheap polyester tie, then at the men who were bowing to him as if he were a deity, and finally at his hands, the tattooed hands that were currently shaking as he gripped the coffee tray. The confusion in her eyes was so deep it looked like a physical wound. She was trying to reconcile the struggling waiter who worried about his car repairs with the young master of a criminal empire, and the two images simply would not fit together. Kenji felt the last remnants of his lie crumbling into dust at his feet. The betrayal wasn't in the wealth or the power, it was in the fundamental theft of her reality. He saw the exact moment her heart broke, not because of who he was, but because of who he wasn't. She looked at the cheap ring box peeking out of his apron pocket, the one he had intended to use to promise her a life of honest poverty, and a single silent tear tracked down her cheek. "Liam?" she whispered, the name sounding like a plea for the world to make sense again. The enforcers stepped closer, their shadows engulfing her small table, their hands moving toward their jackets in a silent warning to the room. Kenji finally dropped the tray. The ceramic shattered against the floor, spraying shards of white across his shoes, a perfect metaphor for the ruins of the life he had tried to steal. He wanted to reach for her, to tell her that Liam was still there, but as Daiki stepped forward to drape a heavy, silk-lined overcoat over his waiter's uniform, Kenji realized that Liam had never actually existed. He was the shadow dragon, and he had just burned the only person who ever truly saw him. The silence that had followed the enforcer's bow was not broken by words, but by the sudden, rhythmic thud of a high-caliber engine decelerating violently outside. Kenji's instincts, honed by years of surviving the treacherous currents of the Sato syndicate, screamed a warning before the first window shattered. He didn't think, he reacted. In one fluid motion, he leaped over the mahogany counter, the silk overcoat Daiki had placed on his shoulders billowing like a dark wing. He reached Mia just as the first spray of gunfire raked across the brickwork of the Rusty Anchor Bistro. The sound was deafening, a staccato rhythm of lead chewing through glass and wood. Kenji tackled Mia to the floor, using his own body as a human shield, tucking her head beneath his chest as the window she had been sitting next to exploded into a million glittering diamonds of lethal shards. Mia let out a choked scream, her hands clutching at the lapels of his waiter's shirt, but Kenji held her with a grip of iron. "Stay down! Don't look up!" he commanded, his voice no longer the gentle, soft-spoken tone of Liam the waiter. It was the voice of the dragon, cold, authoritative, and utterly unshakable. Around them, the bistro turned into a war zone. Tables were overturned as the Sato enforcers drew their weapons, returning fire with a surgical precision that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic spray coming from the street. Kenji felt the heat of a bullet whiz past his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. His entire universe had narrowed down to the trembling girl in his arms. He could feel her heart racing against his ribs, a frantic, terrified bird trapped in a cage of his making. As a second wave of gunfire erupted, Kenji realized the shooters were moving toward the entrance. He had to act, or they would be cornered. He looked at Daiki, who was pinned behind a heavy oak pillar. With a sharp nod, Kenji signaled a tactical shift. He reached out and grabbed a heavy metal serving tray from the floor, the very one he had dropped moments ago. As a hitman in a leather jacket burst through the shattered door, Kenji rose in a half-crouch. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't want Mia to see him pull a trigger. Instead, he launched the heavy tray with a flick of his wrist. It caught the gunman squarely in the chest, the force of the impact sending him reeling back into the street. Kenji moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, stepping over the debris to intercept another attacker at the threshold. Mia watched from the floor, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended the flying bullets. She saw the man she loved transform. He wasn't hurting people with cruelty. He was moving with a singular, protective fury. He disarmed a man twice his size with a twist of the wrist that looked like a dance, casting the weapon into the shadows before shoving the intruder back out into the night. Every movement was calculated to keep the violence away from her. He was a whirlwind of controlled power, a barrier of flesh and bone standing between her and the abyss. He wasn't the victim of this chaos. He was the master of it. For the first time, she saw the dragon in the light, the way he anticipated the enemy's movements, the way his eyes remained calm while the world burned. When the last of the attackers retreated to their vehicles and sped away, leaving the street in a ringing, gunpowder-scented silence, Kenji didn't chase them. He immediately dropped back to his knees beside Mia, his hands hovering over her face, checking for cuts or bruises, with a tenderness that seemed impossible given the carnage he had just orchestrated. His makeup was entirely gone now, smeared away by sweat and friction, revealing the full, dark coil of the dragon tattoo that wound up his neck and disappeared into his hairline. He looked like a monster, but his eyes were filled with an agonizing, desperate love. He had used his power to save her, but as he reached out to touch her cheek, she flinched, not from the violence outside, but from the man standing right in front of her. The dragon had saved her life, but in doing so, he had truly killed Liam. The safe house was a fortress of glass and cold, gray marble, perched high above the city like a hawk's nest. Inside, the air was filtered and silent, a stark contrast to the grease-scented chaos of the Rusty Anchor. Mia stood in the center of the sprawling living area, her blue dress torn at the hem and stained with the soot of the explosion. She looked small against the backdrop of the sprawling metropolis below, her shoulders shaking with a silent, rhythmic tremor. Outside the reinforced door, the shadows of armed men flickered, men who bowed to the person she thought she knew. Kenji stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his waiter's shirt discarded, revealing the black silk undershirt that clung to his frame. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse in the dim light, a permanent reminder of the chasm that now lay between them. He watched her through the reflection in the glass, his heart heavy with a grief that no amount of wealth could anesthetize. Mia suddenly turned, her eyes red-rimmed and fierce. She began to walk toward the door, her steps uneven on the polished floor. "I can't stay here," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "I don't know who you are. I don't know what any of this is." She reached for the handle, expecting the electronic lock to hiss or the guards outside to bar her path with crossed rifles. She expected the young master to command her to stay, to exercise the terrifying authority she had seen in the bistro. But the lock remained silent, and Kenji didn't move a muscle to intercept her. He didn't use his power. He didn't use his men. He simply stood there, letting her reach the threshold of his world, the door to her freedom just a lever pull away. "The guards won't stop you, Mia," Kenji said softly, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "They have orders to let you walk out that door if that is what you truly want. I will not make you a prisoner in a life you never asked for." Mia paused, her hand hovering over the cold steel of the handle. She turned back to look at him, her expression a mix of terror and profound betrayal. "Everything was a lie," she accused, the words landing like stones in a still pool. "The subway flowers, the broken car, the shifts we worked together. You were just watching me. You were just testing me like a lab animal to see if I was worthy of your throne." Kenji walked slowly toward her, but he stopped 6 feet away, respecting the boundary of her fear. He reached into the pocket of his discarded apron, which lay crumpled on a designer chair, and pulled out a small, battered velvet box. It wasn't the box from the Sato vault, it was the one from the mall jeweler. He opened it, revealing the simple $50 silver band with its tiny, hopeful stone. "This is the only thing in this room that isn't a lie," he said, his voice trembling for the first time. He held it out, not as a king offering a gift, but as a man offering a piece of his soul. "The man you loved wasn't a character I played to trick you. He was the only part of me that's real. Liam is the man I wanted to be. Kenji is just the man I was forced to become." He looked down at the cheap ring, the metal dull against the backdrop of his $1,000,000 view. "When I was with you at that bistro, I wasn't pretending to be happy. I was happy. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I didn't have to plan for a betrayal. I just had to worry about making you laugh and getting your coffee order right." He took a final step forward, placing the ring on the table between them. "I bought this with tips I earned by sweating over a stove, Mia. I didn't use the family's blood money for this. I used Liam's money. If you walk out that door, take the memory of him with you. Because without you, Kenji Sato is just a ghost in a suit." Mia looked at the ring, then back at his eyes, and for a heartbeat, the silence of the safe house felt like the beginning of a new world. The air in the Sato ancestral estate was cold, smelling of ancient cedar and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Kenji walked through the cavernous hallways, his footsteps echoing like a slow, rhythmic drumbeat against the polished marble. He was no longer wearing the waiter's white shirt, but he wasn't wearing the syndicate's silk either. He wore a simple black sweater, his neck tattoo exposed and defiant. At the end of the hall, his father sat behind a desk of carved obsidian, a man whose shadow had defined Kenji's entire existence. The elder Sato didn't look up, his eyes fixed on a ledger of territories and blood debts. To him, Kenji was not a son, but a high-value asset, a weapon forged to ensure the family's immortality. Kenji stood before him, the weight of the moment pressing down on his lungs, more terrifying than any gunfight he had ever survived in the back alleys of the city. "You are late for the briefing," his father said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The hit on the bistro was a lapse in your security. We must retaliate tonight to show the city that the Shadow Dragon does not bleed." Kenji didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed his heavy, gold-crested signet ring on the desk. The clatter of the gold against the stone sounded like a gavel bringing a trial to a close. "There will be no retaliation," Kenji said, his voice steady and devoid of the Liam persona's hesitation. "And there will be no more Shadow Dragon. I am done, father. I am abdicating my position as heir, effective immediately. I want nothing from the vaults, nothing from the accounts, and nothing from the name." His father finally looked up, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure predatory ice. "You would walk away from an empire for a nurse who has nothing? You would be a ghost, Kenji. You would be a man with a target on his back and no shield to protect him." Kenji leaned over the desk, his face inches from the man who had raised him to be a monster. "I've spent my life as a shield for your greed," Kenji whispered. "But I found something worth more than all of this. I found someone who loved a man who had nothing. If you try to follow us, if you even send a single shadow into her life, I will use every secret I learned at your side to burn this house to the ground. Let me go, and the Sato name dies with you. Force me to stay, and I will destroy it myself." The silence that followed was a vacuum, a test of wills that felt like an eternity. Finally, the elder Sato gave a curt, disgusted flick of his hand, a gesture that signaled Kenji was no longer a son, but a stranger. Kenji turned and walked out, leaving behind the billions, the power, and the darkness. He felt lighter with every step, the invisible chains of his birthright snapping one by one. He drove through the night, leaving the neon-soaked skyline of his former kingdom behind, until the air began to smell of salt and wet sand. He pulled into the driveway of a small, weathered cottage on the coast of a quiet seaside town, where the only sounds were the crashing of waves and the distant call of a lighthouse. Mia was standing on the porch, wrapped in a thick cardigan, watching the horizon. She didn't look like a girl caught in a mafia thriller. She looked like herself again. As Kenji stepped out of the car, he didn't check his surroundings for snipers or SUVs. He simply walked to her, pulling the simple silver ring from his pocket, the one he had bought with honest tips. "No more secrets," he said, taking her hand. "No more masks, just me." Mia looked at him, seeing the man who had sacrificed an empire just to stand beside her in the rain. She didn't see a young master or a dragon. She saw Liam, the man who finally belonged to himself. She smiled, a soft, healing light that washed away the scars of the bistro, and as they walked into their small, quiet home together, the Shadow Dragon was finally at peace. In the end, Kenji learned that you can build an empire of gold, but it's worthless if the foundation is built on a lie. He chose a life of peace over a life of power, proving that the man makes the money doesn't make the man. If you enjoyed this journey from the shadows of the Mafia to the shores of a new beginning, subscribe and ring the bell. We've got more stories of high stakes and deep secrets coming your way.